All right, so yesterday we learned section 2.2, solving inequalities with addition and subtraction. Today we're going to solve inequalities with multiplication and division. Eventually we're going to be putting all of these together and we're going to be solving multiple stepped inequalities that will require us to add, subtract, multiply, and divide to solve, but today we're just going to be solving with one step. So your whole goal is to solve for the missing variable. This says 4b is greater than or equal to 36. I'm solving for b. So what you would have to do is get rid of that 4, and to get rid of it, you would undo what's currently happening. This is multiplication, so to undo multiplication, we would divide. When we divide by a positive number, everything stays exactly the same. We're going to have b here, we're going to have a greater than or equal to, and 36 divided by 4 is 9. So my answer is b is greater than or equal to 9. We come over here to the graph. The endpoint is 9, and that would be a closed circle. And anything greater than or equal to it would be anything to the right. The next problem says negative 24 is greater than or equal to 3x. So we're solving this for x. What would we do to both sides to get rid of that 3? Yep. So we're going to divide here, divide here. Negative 24 divided by 3 is a negative 8. Symbol stays the same, and we're left with this. Negative 8 is greater than or equal to x. Now, I know just from the problem that I'm going to have to put negative 8 on my number line, and I know from the symbol it's going to be a closed circle. But like I keep stressing, it's hard for me to graph this, so I prefer to flip the x and flip the number, and then when you do that, you also have to flip the sign. The answers are actually not to the right of negative 8, they're to the left of negative 8. The solutions are anything less than or equal to negative 8. When it's given with the number first, negative 8 is greater than or equal to all of the solutions, means negative 8 is the biggest number, which would then mean that all of the other numbers are to the left of it. That doesn't make as much sense to me as flipping it so that the variable comes first, then I understand the direction better. Moving on to letter C. These two are division problems currently that we would have to undo. So this says x divided by 8 is greater than negative 5. To undo division, we will multiply. So we're going to multiply both sides by the number that's being divided, and that is 8. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 8. These cancel out. I'm left with x is greater than negative 5 times 8 is negative 40. So this is my answer in inequality form. Now it's time to graph. We will put negative 40 on the number line. Because it's a greater than symbol, that means negative 40 is not a solution. It's an open circle. And anything bigger than it would be anything to the right of it. And then this last question, letter D, says 1/5 times W is less than or equal to negative 6. You have two options to solve this problem. One option is, this is multiplication. So 1/5 times W is being multiplied. To undo that 1/5, I could divide both sides by it, but it just looks a little weird. And if for whatever reason you didn't have a calculator, it's probably really hard for you to figure out what to even do here when you do negative 6 divided by 1/5. If you do have a calculator, when you do negative 6 divided by 1/5, it's going to equal negative 30. And you might be wondering, well, how does that actually work? Let me show you how that does work. So 1/5 times W is less than or equal to negative 6. So instead of canceling this out with division, what I can do is actually multiply by the reciprocal of 1/5 to make it equal 1. The reciprocal is taking 1/5 and flipping it upside down. What would the reciprocal be of 1/5? Yeah, 5/1, or I think you're just trying to say 5, and that's exactly it. So you can either multiply by 5/1 or just multiply it by 5. 5 times 1/5 cancels this out to just be 1W. Negative 6 times 5 we know is just negative 30. When you divide by a fraction, what happens is this second fraction actually flips upside down and turns into multiplication by its reciprocal like that. That's why we get this answer for both of these. If you're like, I don't really know what you're talking about, and you decided to divide by 1/5, as long as you have a calculator, you should be good to go. Negative 30 is the number we would need on my endpoint. It's going to be a closed circle. Anything less than it would be anything to the left. So all 4 of these problems had positive coefficients. That means that when we solved all 4 of these problems, we divided or multiplied by a positive number. However, every time we divide or multiply by a negative number, something happens with inequalities. So all 4 of these examples have negative numbers we'll be dividing by. This says negative 7 times y. I know I'll have to divide by negative 7. This is x divided by negative 5. I know I'll have to multiply by negative 5. Whenever you multiply or divide by a negative coefficient, the direction of the inequality has to be reversed in order for it to still be equivalent. And here's why. Here's a true inequality. 2 is less than 3. So this inequality is currently true since 2 is a smaller number than 3. If I was to take this, though, and multiply it by a negative number, let's multiply everything by negative 2. So I'll multiply this side by negative 2 and this side by negative 2. So if I take this inequality and I multiply both sides by negative 2, negative 2 times 2 is negative 4, and 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. Looking at the number line, if this is 0, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, and negative 6, is it true that negative 4 is less than negative 6? Is negative 4 smaller than negative 6? No, it's closer to 0. It's actually larger. That's why when we multiply by a negative number, you have to actually flip the symbol. It works for division too. If you divide by a negative number, you have to flip the symbol. So it's weird because there's a couple times you have to flip the symbol. You have to flip the symbol when you are going to graph, and if it makes more sense to you to put the variable first, you have to flip the symbol. You also have to flip the symbol when you divide or multiply by a negative number. So when I go to solve this problem, I'm going to divide both sides by negative 7. When I divide by negative 7, we just have to be careful because I divide by a negative. This sign flips from less than or equal to be greater than or equal to. And 35 divided by negative 7 is negative 5. So this is my answer. This is the biggest mistake I see students make throughout this whole section. Once we get to really difficult inequalities and we're doing all sorts of things, combining like terms, distributive property, moving things from left to right, I always see students forget to flip the sign when you divide by a negative or when you multiply by a negative. So on my graph, I have negative 5. The answers are not to the left of it. Anything that's greater than or equal to it will be to the right. I'm going to rewrite letter B. It says x divided by negative 5 is less than or equal to another negative 5. Well, right now we have to undo what's happening. We have division right now. Everything's being divided by negative 5. To cancel that out, I do the opposite. To cancel out dividing by negative 5, I multiply by negative 5. We have to be very careful here because when I multiply by a negative number, this sign is going to flip from less than or equal to greater than or equal to. The sign just changes its, it reverses the way that it opens up to the number that it would usually open up to. So it's just going to change directions. When I multiply by negative 5, these cancel out. I'm left with x, and this goes from less than or equal to greater than or equal to, and negative 5 times negative 5 is a positive 25. So on my number line, I have 25 here, closed circle. Anything that's greater than or equal to it would be anything to the right of it. Okay, a couple more before we're going to try some on our own. Oh, just one more. All right, letter C. Letter C says 1 is greater than or equal to negative 1/10 z. I'm going to rewrite it. Now, a lot of students and a lot of people in general get confused when there's a negative number and not knowing where the negative should go. So there's three ways that a negative can be present. A negative can be on the outside of the fraction, like this example says negative 1/10. And the negatives is just on the outside. The negative can also be in the numerator of the fraction, or the negative can be in the denominator of the fraction. As long as you only have one negative, that means that this number is negative. Negative 1/10 can look like this one, it can look like this one, or it can look like this one. The negative here is on the outside, showing that this is a negative 1/10. The negative here is in the numerator, showing that this is negative 1/10. The negative is in the denominator, showing that this is negative 1/10. The top two are the ones we probably see the most. This is the type that I use the most. And then this gets very confusing for people because they're not sure where that negative is supposed to go. I usually put my negatives in the numerator because that's just easiest for me, but it doesn't actually matter. We have two options to solve this one for z. So if we want to solve this by doing the opposite of what's happening, right now this is negative 1/10 times z. So to undo multiplication, I could divide both sides. It's just going to look a little funky because I'm going to be dividing by a negative fraction. So you would definitely want your calculator for this, because if you didn't have one, I don't know how you'd be able to do 1 divided by negative 1/10. You would maybe not know how to do that. Okay? So this one's going to be weird because you are dividing by a fraction. You would need your calculator. And when you divide 1 divided by negative 1/10, it's going to end up being negative 10 as your answer. And because we were dividing by a negative number, the sign is going to flip from greater than or equal to less than or equal to, like this. If we use the other method, instead of dividing, we multiply by the reciprocal. The reciprocal of negative 1/10 is negative 10 over 1. So I can multiply both sides by negative 10 over 1 as well. That cancels and that cancels. Negative 10 over 1 times 1 is just negative 10, which is easier than this whole mess. And the sign still flips, and I would have negative 10 is less than or equal to z. I know this is going to be a negative 10 on my graph with a closed circle, but again, I struggle with graphing like this. So even though I flip the sign when I divide it by that negative, or when I multiply by that negative, I'm actually going to have to flip it again because I'm going to move things around and flip the number and variable, which will then bring me back to the original symbol, believe it or not, because I need to flip it again. The answers are anything that's going to be to the right of negative 10 because the solutions are greater than or equal to. So what I want you guys to do now is try the rest of the problems on the next page. So there's a page of you try problems. Let's see how many we have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So go ahead and try these and also graph them. And then we will go over these probably next class.